And that's bad because now I even have something on the bottom of my screen taped to it that says record. But I'm glad you noticed. Thank you. Okay, you should be able to see a page that says Biology 106 Prokaryote genus paper. Let me know if it's not what you're seeing, and I'll correct my mistake. So this paper is going to be 1 to 2 pages long. As I say, it'll be due when the big set of questions over bacteria and archaea and viruses is due, but you don't necessarily have to attach this. You can send it in separately. So the top line is going to be the title of your paper. So instead of Biology 106 Eukaryote genus paper, you know, your title can just be the name of the genus that you're writing about. But if you'd prefer, you can give it something else. You can talk about the bacteria that's killed more people than any other bacteria, you know, the most deadly bacteria. So you can give it some other title if you would like. Your title is going to be in boldface. Now your whole paper is only going to be 1 to 2 pages, so it's not going to be very long. 3 to 5 paragraphs. Can be either 1.5 or double spaced. You're going to have 1-inch margins. So very similar to if you've ever, most of these things are similar to what you would have typed out if you were typing a hard copy. You're going to use 10, 12, or 14-point font, and it's going to be Times or Times New Roman. There are a couple of variations of Times, but that's kind of a standard font for a lot of technical papers. So we're going to use that. So the top line is going to be your title. It's going to be in bold print. Underneath that is going to be your name. And your name is not in bold print, so notice that doesn't specify that. Everything is left justified, which means it butts up against the left-hand margin. So you don't want to have it fully justified or right justified or centered or you know, any of the alternatives like that you can do. After your name, you're going to skip 1 line, and then you're going to begin the actual text of your paper. So you're going to write about, oops, should be 2 separate words, 1 genus of bacteria, either one of the ones from the list or a different one if you want. Remember what we've said. You're going to italicize the genus and species names. You're going to capitalize the genus name, but remember the species name is not capitalized. And also remember that something I said earlier, you never use the species name without the genus name. So maybe you're writing about Staphylococcus and you're going to write about Staphylococcus aureus, which is 1 species. So after you say Staphylococcus, then you can say S. aureus. You don't have to write out Staphylococcus each time. Now notice that S period, that still should be italicized because you're just abbreviating the genus name. So the genus and species have to be italicized, species not capitalized, genus capitalized. So some things you might want to talk about, the number of species that are in this genus. Some of the species that were selected because there are a lot of species in them. Some general information about this genus, even if you just focus on 1 species. You might be going to talk about Staphylococcus aureus, but there's more than 1 species in this genus. So, you know, include some general information. Kind of like if you were writing about primates and you were going to focus on gorillas, you would still want to include some general information about primates. So maybe the general information that you include is, you know, what are the overall characteristics of the organisms in this genus? What shape are the cells? Are they gram-positive or gram-negative? Remember, that was one of the types of stains that we talked about to identify cells the other day. And there are some other things that you might include as well. I don't want to be too prescriptive and tell you exactly what to include, because partly what you include will depend on the type of bacteria you choose to write about. There are some of those genera that are on the list that there's only one species in the whole genus. So if you do that, pretty much you're going to be talking about that one species, because that's all there is. So you may want to include some historical perspective. How was this genus discovered? When I say how was its importance realized? How did they figure out that, this particular bacteria causes a certain disease? Or how did they figure out it could be used to make a certain industrial process? So what's the importance of this genus or of the particular species you're looking at? And there's a couple of different ways you could think about the importance. You could think about its economic importance. Some bacteria are used to make food. Some bacteria are used in other industrial processes. Or you could look at its environmental importance. What does it do in the ecosystem? Do other living organisms depend upon it to survive? Or you could look at its medical importance. What diseases does it cause? Or is it used in genetic engineering to produce proteins that we then use to treat disease? Now, one of the things I would like you to do is don't just say, well, this is the bacteria that's sometimes called the flesh-eating bacteria. Okay, well, if you tell me that, what exactly does it mean when we say it's the flesh-eating bacteria? Does it destroy your skin? Does it destroy tissue under the skin? Does it destroy your whole body? Is it limited in what type of tissues it attacks? If it has an industrial use, if you say, well, this type of bacteria is used to make bologna, how do they use it to make bologna? What do they give it as a food source? What do they potentially have to do to produce the product they want? So notice the basic idea of this paper, as it mentions up above, 3 to 5 paragraphs. So you're going to have kind of an introduction to your topic, and then somewhere between 1 and 3 paragraphs going into a little more detail about your topic, focusing maybe on one particular species. Why is it important? How do we know it's important? What does it do in terms of being important? And I want you to think, as you're writing this, imagine that you were writing this paper and it was going to be read by one of your friends who doesn't know very much science. So don't use a lot of things that thinking that, well, Mr. Griffith will understand what I'm saying. Because one of the things I usually do is I have an English teacher who also reads these papers with me. And although they're better than they were when they first started doing this, they're not an expert. So think about the idea that you're writing this paper to explain it to someone who's educated, but not necessarily a biologist. Now, we're gradually going to learn how to do citations for science papers, but we're going to start out kind of slowly. So you have to have at least 3 in-text citations. And you put the number of the citation in parentheses after the text. So if you have a quote, then after the quote, you put, if it's your first citation, in parentheses, you put parentheses with a 1 inside. Notice that the citations get numbered just in the order that you use them, not in alphabetical order or anything like that. And notice that you might use some particular source for citation 1, and then you might come back to that same source later in the paper. So you might use source 1, and then you have citation 2, citation 3, citation 4. And then after citation 22, you might have citation 1 again, because you're going back to that first source of information that you used. So you don't number each citation separately. If this citation is from, Mr. Griffith's Big Book of Biology, then every time you refer to Mr. Griffith's Big Book of Biology, it would have a citation number 1 by it. So keep that in mind. So you've got to have at least 3 of these. We'll talk a little bit more about these at the end because you're going to list them. At the end, after you've written everything, and keep in mind, this is not a very long paper, but you want to have at least a sentence that's kind of a conclusion that sums things up. You don't want to just stop. Sometimes, since this says it has to be 1 to 2 pages, what I've seen students do is they get down to the last line on the first page and all of a sudden it stops and it's kind of right in the middle of its topic, but it doesn't finish explaining it because they got 1 page. So you also want your paper to have some coherence to make sense. So after you finish with the text, skip a line, and then you're going to have a section titled References. And notice it will be in bold font. That's why it's boldface here. And then you skip a line, and notice one of the things that I'm sure you've heard in English classes, but you're only going to list references that you cited in your paper. So if you have 3 citations in your paper, if you have citation 1, 2, and 3, you can't have 4 references in this part of the book paper because you only use 3 in your paper. So all the citations that you refer to up in your text have to be back here in the references. All the references have to be up in the citations. Now, as I said, you could use 1 reference. You might have 5 citations to reference number 1. But basically, every number that's in the text should also be back here. And so you're going to list the references by their number. And you're going to list them in numerical order. So number 1 will be listed first, and it's listed just like it is as in the text. It's listed as number 1 in parentheses, and then number 2. And for this paper, as I said, we're going to gradually get into it. Your citation is just going to be the web address of the page where you got this information. Now, if the article that you got it from has several pages, which is quite possible, then you give the web address of the very first page. Now, keep in mind, if you do that, you have to make sure that if you're looking at something that has 3 pages, you have to make sure it's really 3 pages of the same article and that you're not clicking a link to go to a separate article, because if you're going to a separate article, that would really be a separate citation. So let's think a little bit about where you can get your references and what you have to reference. And you're fairly limited in a science paper about where you can get information from. So I mentioned earlier, you could use Wikipedia, and that's pretty good for general information. But for the citations in your paper, it's got to come from a university or a college. So the University of Wisconsin at Madison has a good site. Ohio State University has a good site. University of Minnesota has a good site. It can come from government organizations. So say you were writing about the bacteria that caused strep throat. You might get information from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, or something else. Can be from medical organizations. So it could be from something like the AMA, the American Medical Association, or the ADA, the American Dental Association, if you were writing about dental caries, what we sometimes call cavities. You might get information from an industrial organization. For instance, There are several organizations that look at how food is produced. So you might have a reference from the ADA, the American Department of Agriculture, but you might also have a reference from an organization that regulates how something like yogurt is produced. Or it can be an article from a peer-reviewed journal. Now in science, a peer-reviewed journal, your peers are your equals. So say you're writing about a bacteria that's been associated with ulcers. You can probably find some online articles about this, or at least their abstracts, that come from places like the New England Journal of Medicine or the Journal of the American Medical Association. Those are called peer-reviewed journals because if you submit an article to them, before they publish that article, other people who are experts in the field look at this article and see if it makes sense. So remember back in Biology 105, we talked about when you do an experiment, you want to control all the variables that could affect your results except one, the one that you're interested in. So if you're saying that, you know, people who have Streptococcus bacteria get ulcers, how did you find this information out? How did you test this information? And this is why you can't use Wikipedia as a reference. Wikipedia is not peer-reviewed. Wikipedia has ways that people can access articles and can print information. And they do have editors that check that information. But the editors that they have are not necessarily experts in their field. If you were publishing a paper about cardiology in a scientific journal, that article would be reviewed by cardiologists. In Wikipedia, it might be reviewed by somebody who's checking other cardiology sources. So it doesn't qualify as a peer-reviewed journal. Now, keep in mind, there's 3 types of things you have to cite. So you have to cite direct quotes, and they should be in quotation marks. But you also have to cite paraphrases of what your references say. Suppose you read an article by this crazy guy called Griffith, and he says, I don't think COVID-19 is caused by a virus. I think COVID-19 is caused by a parasitic worm. Well, you might have a direct quote, and you might have, quote, Griffith says that 90% of all COVID-19 cases are caused by parasitic worms, end quote. Or you might not quote me, but you might paraphrase me. In a 2019 article, Griffith said that most cases of COVID-19 are caused by parasitic worms. Or you might not even paraphrase me. You might just say, some scientists even believe that COVID-19 is caused by parasitic worms. And if you got that information from this webpage that Griffith wrote, then you have to cite that. Now, keep in mind, this might seem like a lot, but when you look at science papers, a typical science paper that's 2 pages long, for instance, when Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA, their paper was less than 2 pages long. Well, it was about 2 pages, I guess, if you count the drawing they had. And they had 10 references, 11 references. So scientific papers do tend to have a lot of references. Now, what don't you have to cite? You don't have to cite what's commonly known information. So what's commonly known information? Well, again, think of your audience here. So even though I said I want you to write this for an audience that is well educated, but not necessarily well educated in biology, think about somebody who's had Biology 105 and Biology 106 and who has a copy of our textbook. Well, you don't have to, since you're writing about bacteria, you don't have to say that bacteria have prokaryotic cells. Oh, and prokaryotic cells are cells that don't have a nucleus or membrane-bound organelles. And membrane-bound organelles are things like the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus and the mitochondrion. So you can assume that someone who's reading this paper knows that type of information. If you're talking about the shape of the cells, whether they're bacillus or coccus or spirillum, you don't necessarily have to cite that information. That's pretty well known. Most genera only have one type of shape, no matter how many species they have. And that shape is part of that group. So you might say, okay, everything in this genus is bacillus shaped, but you don't have to explain what bacillus shape is. So one way to think about it is if you were writing a history paper, you might be writing about the American Revolution. And if you say something about George Washington, you don't have to say, he later became first president of the United States. And if you say that, you don't have to have a reference because that's considered to be common knowledge that Washington was the first president of the United States. So things that are considered to be common knowledge, you don't have to cite. Now, are there any questions about how you're going to approach this paper? Okay, well, what I would like you to do now, this is going to be a relatively short class, but by Thursday, I want you to send me the name of the genus that you're going to be writing about. So before we come to class on Thursday, doesn't have to be much. You can send me an email and just tell me, you know, I want to write about Streptococcus. I want to write about Staphylococcus. I want to write about Mycobacterium. Whatever genus you choose. Keep in mind, I would recommend that you start looking at a few references because you'll probably have an assignment next Monday where you'll have to give me 3 references. So if you're looking at whatever Streptococcus, start keeping track and bookmarking some of your references, and it'll make your life easier later on. Are there any questions about this?
So when is it going to be due?
This is going to be due when the bacteria, virus, archaea questions are due. And most likely this will be towards the end of next week. So probably about next Thursday. So that's why I want to know which genus you're going to write about by this Thursday. And as I say, we'll talk later in the week, but I'm going to ask you for some references by Monday because neither one of us will be happy if you write your whole paper the night before it's due. So this way you at least have to choose a topic and start looking for some references a little bit at a time. You won't like it if you have to stay up all night writing, and I won't want to read what you wrote if you stayed up all night writing it, probably. Any other questions? Okay, if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to stop sharing this and I'm going to let you go. And I will send you an email, but don't forget what I said. You will have to tell me by Wednesday what your topic is going to be, which genus you want to write about. Please check with me before then if you're going to write about a genus that isn't on the list. If you're going to choose one that's on the list, you don't have to check with me. Just have to tell me. Any questions about that? Okay. If not, I'm going to let you go so that you have some time to look up some bacteria then.
Mr. Buffett.
Don't forget that the list of bacteria is actually from last week. It was posted before class on Thursday or Friday. I don't remember which. Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, for the genus we're gonna pick, do we have to tell you in class or we have to submit it?
You can just send me an email. That's probably better because usually I don't like other people to know everybody else's business.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
I will tell you when I get your choice, I will tell you if somebody else is going to write about that too, in case you want to write about one that nobody else is doing.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?